And whoever trusts in Allah, Allah is enough for him. Allah will suffice him. You know. But people trapped in multiplicity, al-hakum takathuru, they're just completely trapped in all this takathur, vying, trying to get more. It's that's where all the problems start. So to finish up on this, he's giving you basically the 5 ways of burhan in logic. And I mentioned, we went over yesterday the rules. There's different ways to determine the validity of these syllogisms, and you have Venn diagrams, you have Euler's these circles that you do, and then you have Aristotle's 6 ways, and then you have the way of determining what type of a mood it is and whether it's valid or not in terms of the each of the 4 figures has moods that are either valid or invalid. So those are the ways that you can test. But the easiest and the way that will give you the reason why the thing is invalid are the 6 rules of the syllogism. And the first rule was what? 3 terms, right? It has to have 3 terms, and only 3 terms, always. The syllogism has 3 terms. They can be mentioned twice. The middle term is mentioned twice in the premises, always. And that's why you determine, the first thing you should do when you look at a syllogism is determine the middle term, the M term. And it'll always be the one that is mentioned twice. So whenever you see it, you just immediately do that. The second thing you want to know is the distribution. So you want to determine whether something is distributed or undistributed, which means that's the extension of it. It's what it refers to, right? Remember, you have the meaning and the reference. You have the extension. You have the denotation. What all the things that it refers to. When it's undistributed, it means it doesn't cover all of those things, and that's a major source of fallacy when you do that. And so you always want to determine, because that middle term has to be distributed at least once in those 2 premises, which it has to be distributed because you're comparing the major term and the minor term to the middle term. And so it's really important for it to have a comparison that's valid, because if you're only talking about part of that, right, because it's the law of all or nothing, you have to be talking about all of it in order for it to make sense when you're looking at these 2 things to see whether they are the same or whether they're different. Excuse me. So the distribution is easy. You have to know your A, E, I, and O, right? Those 4 types of sentences. The universal sentences, in the affirmative, you have the distributed, undistributed. So in that first one, A, put D and U. A, D, and U. So A has a distributed subject, an undistributed predicate. And this is probably the most common way that people make mistakes in their reasoning, is by this problem, which is the fallacy of the undistributed middle. It's the most common problem. And particularly with the AA, with using 2 positives. All birds are animals. All, I mean, this is a silly one. That, all birds are animals. All humans are animals. Therefore, all humans are birds. That's silly. But you can get into ones where, you can get into ones where, well, all terrorists are bad, right? All Muslims are terrorists. Therefore, all Muslims are bad. And there's a lot of people that's how they reason. So it's very problematic. I mean, that obviously has false premise. The other one didn't, which is another problem. But in terms of just the validity of the syllogism, if the premise was sound, it's still a fallacy. Because you can't take an undistributed middle, right? All terrorists are bad. So that doesn't include all bad things. It's making a universal statement about terrorists, but not about bad. The bad is not distributed, because there are other ways of being bad than terrorism, all right? So that's a really important one to keep in mind, is the undistributed middle problem. So it has to have 3 terms, and the terms have to be the same in their signification and their supposition. So they have to have the same meaning, but they also have to have that contextually, because you can have things that differ contextually. So that's really important, is knowing that your term is a proper term, right? That it's defined properly, right? And what are what's the rules of definition? Coextensive, clear, literal, brief, can't be negative, can't be circular. So you have to get these things down. You know, it's really important to get them down so you really have them, so that you can. So you have that first one, the A, it's a DU, distributed, undistributed. So the subject is always distributed in a kulliya mujiba, in a affirmative universal, and it's always, the predicate is always undistributed. The next one, the E, is what? The E. It's DD. It's always distributed in both the subject and the predicate, which is why it's always reversible. In the acts, you can always reverse it, and it's sound. So, no men are angels, no angels are men. No animals are rocks, no rocks are animals, right? So it's always distributed. So the E is always distributed. And then the I, some men are Muslims. What's that? What's the I? You and you. So they're both undistributed. So the I is UU. So you have DU, DD, UU. And then what's the O going to be? Yeah, exactly. Good. So that's it. So that's really important to know in order for you to determine whether the middle term is distributed. That's all you have to know, those 4 patterns. And you can determine if the middle is undistributed and see if that fallacy is there, the undistributed middle fallacy. All right, that's all you need to know. So the A is DU, the E is DD, the I is UU, and the O is UD. And that's what you need to know. So the O is the opposite of the A. And then in the so that's the 3 terms, right? It has to have the second rule is what? Second rule is what? It can only have 3 propositions. So 3 terms, 3 propositions, right? 3 terms, 3 propositions. And then the third rule is that the middle term has to be distributed. We went over that just now. The middle term has to be distributed. And then the 4th rule, and that's the fallacy of the undistributed middle. The 4th rule is really important too, because this is another source of problem in the syllogism. The 4th rule is that a term, if it's going to be distributed in the conclusion, it has to have been distributed in one of the premises. It can't be, you can't have a term that is undistributed in the premises and then you give it distribution in the conclusion. You can have a term that's distributed in the premise, and it's undistributed in the conclusion. Because, if you know everything about something, right? If you know something about everything, then you know something about some of those things. So that'll work. But you can't have a distribution in that first one. And that's the illicit major. So if I say, for instance, major or minor, depending on which term you distribute in the conclusion. If it's a minor term, then it's the fallacy of the illicit minor. If it's a major term, it's the fallacy of the illicit major. So if I say, for instance, all Muslims pray 5 times a day. All Muslims pray 5 times a day. John prays 5 times a day. Therefore, John is a Muslim. What's the problem? What's that? Right, exactly. So it's not distributed, and so I can't assume from that he's a Muslim, because Christians might pray 5 times a day, or Hindus or Buddhists or other people. All smart people wear glasses. I wear glasses, therefore I'm smart. Right? You can't, it doesn't work. Because it's stupid people can wear glasses as well. So when you say all smart people wear glasses, all you're saying is that the undistributed are the people wearing the glasses, right? The smart people. That's what's undistributed, not the people wearing glasses. That's not distributed. So that's another very common. And then also you can't have 2 negatives. Now the reason for that is you will come up with sound conclusions and unsound conclusions. True conclusions or false ones. So, you can say, for instance, if you say, an odd number is not an even number, right? An odd number is not an even number. 3 is not an even number. Therefore, 3 is not an odd number, right? Because that's 2 negatives. So you can't, there's no conclusion that can be drawn from 2 negatives. Because again, you have to be saying something in order to make that comparison. And in that case, it's clear why it's false. But in other ones, you can come up with no fish or birds, right? No fish or birds. No sharks are fish, therefore no sharks are birds. So there's an example where the conclusion's true, but it didn't follow from the reasoning. Do you see? So you can get both in that type. So you can't have 2 negatives in the premise. And then finally, the 6th one is if one of the negatives, if one of the premises is negative, then the conclusion has to be negative, right? Because that what remember you're comparing to that middle term. So if it's negative, then the conclusion has to be negative. And then the 2 corollaries to that, which are useful because they'll help you understand quickly. They're not rules because they will cause one of those 6 rules to be broken if you analyze it. The first one is you can't have 2 particulars. You can't have 2 particulars in the premises. You have to have one of them has to be a universal. So that just nixes it. It's invalid reasoning. And then the second one is if it's a particular, one of the premises is a particular, then it has to have a particular conclusion. So those are the the ways of determining the validity of a syllogism. And again, it just takes practice. That's all. It's actually not that hard. It just takes practice and to determine what it is. And that's where you have to do those exercises. Like there, you know, in the books that are used in courses, they usually have exercises that you can do. They'll have like 30 syllogisms and what's wrong with these, and then you just have to work it out. And so initially, it's doing the, you know, you want to do your, determine the middle term, determine the, you know, positive, negative, determine if it's distributed or undistributed, and very quickly you can see, using these rules, whether or not it's sound or not. So now coming to the end of this, he has the وأمر قياس الاستثناء في الشرطية الموضوعة فيه إذا كانت متصلة موجبة لزومية, because you can never have an اتفاقية because there's no logical relationship in an اتفاقية, so it has to be لزومية. فاستثناء عين المقدم ينتج عين التالي. So the muqaddam is the consequent, the antecedent, and the tally is the consequent. And so when you have a very common flaw in logic, you have the affirming the denying the affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. It's very common. So, for instance, if you say, you know, if it rains, it's wet outside, and then you say, it didn't rain, therefore it's not wet outside, right? That's not a logical conclusion that can be derived. Why? What's that? Exactly, yeah. So you can't make a conclusion because there could have been other reasons why it was wet outside. Somebody could have just sprayed a hose all over or something. And then also affirming the consequent is another very common. This is a really common one. It's even done in inductive science, makes this mistake also. So this is a really common one, which is where, you know, if it's raining, it's wet outside, right? If it rained, it's wet outside, therefore it rained, right? You can't make that conclusion again because there could have been other reasons. So if you say if it rained, it's wet outside, the only thing that you can determine from that is it rained, therefore it's wet outside. That's the way it works. So that's what he's saying there basically, is that istithna' ayn al-muqaddam yuntiju ayn al-tali, right? So that's the only thing that you can get the consequent from, is by asserting the muqaddam, right? You can't get it those other ways. كقولنا إن كان هذا إنسانا فهو حيوان لكنه إنسان فهو حيوان. So if this man, if this is a man, it's an animal, and indeed it is a man, therefore it's an animal. Do you see? So you can only get that by confirming the consequent. That's what he's saying there. And it's a very common mistake that's made. استثناء نقيض التالي ينتج نقيض المقدم كقولنا إن كان هذا إنسانا فهو حيوان لكنه ليس بحيوان فلا يكون إنسانا. That's the same thing, except it's in the conditional of negating the consequent, right? So here that would be like if it rained, then it's wet outside. It's not wet outside, therefore it didn't rain. You see, those are the two ways it works. You can't do it the other two ways because you'll come to false conclusions. Got it? So that's all he's saying. This is the modus ponens and modus tollens. I mean, this is a very common mistake that's made when you're doing conditionals. وإن كانت منفصلة حقيقية فاستثناء عين أحد الجزئين ينتج نقيض الآخر واستثناء نقيض أحدهما ينتج عين الآخر. So if it were a literal disjunctive proposition, then exclusion of one of the two parts itself yields the contradictory of the other part, and the exclusion of the contradictory of one of the two parts yields the other part itself. So for a syllogism of exclusion with a disjunctive conditional proposition as its major premise, that premise must be affirmative. In addition, either the major premise or the minor premise, which begins with the particle of exclusion, however, or, and indeed, must be universal or singular since it is effective universal. If the major premise of a syllogism of exclusion is disjunctive, it is either mutually exclusive and totally exhaustive. So that's an example where it's mani'at al-jam', right? So it has to be, you can't have the two, like something that's either even or odd. You can't join those two, right? Or, I mean, they say exclusive and inclusive generally in Western terminology. He says totally exhaustive. The first type is discussed above in the text. It has 4 valid moods. For example, in the syllogism, a number is either even or odd. Exclusion of either part yields the contradictory of the other part. That is, however it is even, yields hence it is not odd, and however it is odd, yields hence it is not even. Also, exclusion of the contradictory of either part yields the other part itself. That is, however it is not even, yields hence it is odd, and however it is not odd, yields hence it is even. So that's the first type, because they're mutually exclusive. The second type, if the major premise is mutually exclusive only, right, and not totally exhaustive, has 2 valid moods, as exclusion of one of the two parts itself yields the contradictory of the second part, and 2 invalid moods, as exclusion of the contradictory of one part does not yield anything. For example, in the statement, this thing is either white or black, exclusion of white. However, it is white, yields the contradictory of black. Hence, it is not black, and vice versa. Yet exclusion of the contradictory of white, however, it is not white, or the contradictory of black, however, it is not black, yields nothing. So you can't determine from that whether it doesn't give you that it has to be the other thing like it does in the first type, which has it's exhaustive and mutually exclusive. And then the third type, if the major premise is totally exhaustive only, also has 2 valid moods and 2 invalid moods, the exact opposite of the above. For example, in the statement, Zayd is either a body of water or is not drowning. So exclusion of the contradictory of one part yields the other part itself, and vice versa. However, he is not in a body of water, yields, hence he is not drowning. So in that the third type, however he is in a body of water, or however he is not drowning, yields no conclusion. So if you say he's not in a body of water, we know he's not drowning, right? But to say he's in a body of water doesn't tell us that he's not drowning, right? He could be drowning, he could not be drowning. So those are the 5. And like I said, this is just the ISAGOGE is a very basic text, and it really gives you. It definitely gives you all the technical terms that you're going to come up with, or most of them anyway, that you're going to come up with. And as a basis, it's an excellent basis. If you have the commentaries on it, if you get into the commentaries, generally it's enough in terms of Islamic scholarship to study. The ISAGOGE is enough with a good commentary to do work in usul al-fiqh, and to do work in ilm al-kalam as well, because those are the 2 where you really see it a lot. You'll see it a lot in usul al-fiqh, and you'll see it a lot in ilm al-kalam. These are the 2 areas where logic is prominent. But like Imam al-Ghazali says, it's a propedeutic science of every knowledge. So it's useful in any knowledge, because every knowledge has definitions, so it has conceptualization, it has judgments, and then it has reasoning as part of it. So in that way, it's useful as a propedeutic for any science that we have. So the 5 skills, I'm going to finish tomorrow, so I'll do the 5 skills. There's not much left in there to do that. But these are called the Sina'at al-Khams, and these are the ways of making arguments. There are different ways of making arguments. Burhan is the best way. That's the way of the syllogism. But then you have the awwaliyat, which are like a priori knowledges that we have. And then we have also the mushahadat. Those are our experiences, just through our senses. The mujarrabat, experimentation. So we learn things through experience. And then hadsiyat. And these are, hadsiyat, it's more intuitive. It's things that we know intuitively as opposed to conjectural premises. I mean, the Western philosophical term for hadsiyat is intuition. So it's what you intuit. Something that, like the light of the moon is derived from the light of the sun. That's intuitive. We didn't have proof for that until much later, but it's something that people intuited early on. Uninterpreted premises. So anyway, so we'll do that, inshallah, tomorrow. All right? Inshallah. I hope your Ramadan's going well. Tahara wa kafara. It's a good time. Getting sick is a good thing. The Prophet ﷺ, there's a man, he died, and the Prophet ﷺ, somebody said, Haniyan lahu ma marida qat. What good fortune he had, he never got sick. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Wayhaka, watch out what you're saying. He said, maybe if he got sick, it would have removed sins. There's a completely different way of looking at things. So, I mean, we ask for good health, nasallallahu al-afiyah, but the body is one of the sources of ibtila. And Allah gives you ibtila in your body, weakness and sickness, women, hamalatu wahnan ala wahn, So the pregnancy is a ibtila, source of real difficulty. So, alhamdulillah, inshallah, barakallahu fikum, subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.